invite our first speaker, Andrew Rotten, please.
Kind. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and for having us. And we hope that we'll be able to have a stimulating conversation, despite the fact that it's a four-hander, so it might be a lot of material for you. This is a team effort, and I'm going to hand over in turn to Beata and to Homi to complement what I'm going to say. I'm going to start by setting the scene and really having a snapshot of some of our core analysis and recommendations. And we'll start with this slide is coming up in just a moment. We published, just to go back a bit, on November the 30th, and we registered, we hope, most of the rapidly unfolding events after COVID of the summer, early and late summer and early October. Of course, things continue to change, and uncertainty is still sadly king, not least the trajectory of the virus itself, but also in many other dimensions. So we think that much of what we've said, which was deliberately pitched forward quite a bit, still holds up quite well. What we tried to do is imagine the world that we would find about a year later, that is to say halfway through or towards the final half of this year, and then what is the recovery to reconstruction period that runs through our original horizon of 2025, and then on, of course, to 2030, the horizon of Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. What we can say, and I'm sure the discussion will touch on it, is that some of the scarring effects, some of the long-range durable effects of the crisis are already becoming apparent. And we just don't know exactly where they will settle down. And an obvious example for people living in most Western countries is the education of children and youth and the long-term damage that just a few months out of school can cause. Turning to this mind map, this was a way, I hope everybody can see it, it's a little busy towards the bottom. Think of it as a tale of two halves. The upper portion tries to chart what are some of the challenges that policymakers and decision makers, development actors have in mind. And they're sitting in the middle. And the bottom half is the tools that they and their collaborators and their partners have to act with and facing and what direction they should operate them on. Broadly speaking, we will go more into detail on the basic motivations for aid, because I think some of that is fundamental, and that goes back to the background that we traced in our earlier Horizon 2025 reports. Those unsurprisingly charted the fact that there was a lot more actors, a lot more approaches, a lot more instruments than there would have been only 10 years ago. And among the obvious disruptions and obvious changes, the rise of China as a global development force, the rise of populism in the West with mixed effects, the concentration increasingly on Africa as the future locus of global poverty, and much rhetoric, but very little success in mobilizing private capital for development at anything like the scale that the challenge requires. Some of the other forces that are more recent, I've represented on the top right-hand side, and in particular in some of the dotted lines. So it's no secret that there are global rivalries and competition. It's no secret that there's been disruption of supply chains. There's been fiscal pressures, and of course, there is and will be debt overhang of different kinds in different countries, particularly countries that are unable to issue debt in their own currency. I'm sure Homi will want to speak to that. In the bottom half of this picture, you have the yin and the yang, in a sense, if you don't mind me using that term, of finance and policy. You can't finance, and particularly concessional finance, can't do all the heavy lifting. It is very useful and catalytic, if at best, adjunct, but it can't do all the work that these challenges require. You need also policy coherence, and a collective action between the greens, which is finance of different types, and the blues, which is policy, is what will make or break the success in bouncing back and delivering Agenda 2030. What are the jobs to be done there in the bottom part? And I'm going to expect Beata to talk much more about that. There are basically several different tasks that we have to do. Of course, we have to keep managing the global commons. We need to scale up investment based on the foundations of resilience, which are social foundations and environmental foundations and democratic governance foundations. And you can't kind of assume those away, nor can you improvise them, as I'm sure Homi will remind us, in the framework of a sort of short-term adjustment program or some other kind of construct which has a short shelf life. If they don't exist, you're going to need work over an extended time frame, and that has to be taken into account. But if you have those absorptive capacity, you have a given SDG needs gap, you can work away. If those conditions are not present, you must still do humanitarian aid, and you probably have to do humanitarian aid on a scale and on a duration that we're just not used to. Call it extended humanitarianism, if you will. I'm going to move to the next slide. Thanks very much. Oh, yeah. So we take here a very small subset of our recommendations, which you can read for yourself in the one-page executive summary. I'm going to talk mainly about the yellow highlighted ones, the first and last. I think to some extent, Beata will certainly talk about the fourth and to some extent the second, and Homi will range over 3 and 5. The first is that I think we shouldn't be so naive as not to acknowledge national interest and national interest expressed through the global commons, the fight against challenges which affect us all, alongside the traditional altruistic or solidarity modes. I'll talk more about that in a minute. The second is, as I mentioned earlier, the sheer scale of ambitions. The third is that there really are jobs to be done in tackling the profound blockages for capital flows to developing countries, which are not usually the businesses of aid agencies or development agencies or even foreign ministries, but they need to be tackled. I'll leave the development of the question of environmental and social resilience, except to show that we've had amply demonstrated, including in advanced economies, what happens when social fractures are pressurized by uneven effects of, in this particular case, a pandemic, but it could be alternative threats coming from outside shocks. Homi will talk to us more about solvency and liquidity and debt distress. I don't know if some of you may have read the articles in The Economist just this week on the sort of how debt workouts are playing out, and the fact that we do have a changed landscape of actors and divergent interests, which don't make that any easier. But we do need at least the official agencies should have a luxury to have a different time horizon and to focus on fundamentals, I think is our main point. And finally, and linked to the questions of the divergent interests, there is no deus ex machina of a brave new international corporation organization that is going to solve all our puzzles for us. In fact, there is no homogeneous leadership or possibility of that anytime soon. So we see a more opportunistic, more case-specific, country-specific, and issue-specific collaboration, including obviously with partners like China, and using the skills, the firepower and ideas power of the more agile multilaterals, but they won't necessarily be universal initiatives. Moving to the next one. Do I have, hang on a second. Sorry, can you step back a second? Hi, Beata, could you move on to the next slide? That's it, thank you. So just a little word. I mean, this is quite hackneyed by now. We initially started with this on Horizon 2025 Revisited. A crude way of looking at these three Venn circles of the motivations that people have to give official public international financial assistance, whether it's concessional or not, is a moot point. Could be to say, well, you have love, you have greed, and you have fear. That is a bit of a slander on the motives, noble motives of many people and of taxpayers who are contributing to these efforts. But it's just a way of distinguishing. There are clear direct national interests at stake. If you think of the public interest for a provider country in opening up commodity flows or opening up export markets for its industries, that is a public interest. It isn't a sort of a disgusting thing that we mustn't talk about, but it's very difficult to weigh that in the balance when you're discussing where and how you allocate public support and on what terms. There's clearly been, as the legend says there, a shift, initially perhaps downwards to both direct national interest and foreign policy, but also, of course, global commons protection. And that global commons protection comes in many shapes and sizes. It's obviously climate change. It's obviously fighting internationally spreading diseases. But the real balance between all those things and the subtext of unsustainable movements of people, for example, that are linked to both, varies from country to country. So no single country will be they won't all be in the same place, and they won't all be, not all the body politic of those countries will necessarily be in the same place at the same time. But if you believe that something like this is happening and that there are therefore areas where the competitive urges are stronger and areas where the value and benefit of collaboration is higher, then you would naturally tend to think that it is in the yellow bottom left quadrant, the protecting the global commons, that international partnerships are likely to be perhaps more successful. There will be more interest in them and there is more need for them. Whereas if you find areas where there is a direct clash of, say, commercial interests or rivalries, or simply foreign policy interests that may be linked to security considerations and others, you're going to have trouble beyond the rhetorical level, really assembling powerful coalitions of different types of interests. I'll leave that there and I'll move on to Beata to speak to our resilience framework, going back to the idea of how the reconstruction effort needs to pay attention to some fundamentals.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'll be taking us through the global resilience framework, which is a model that we've kind of constructed to help us illustrate the various tough decisions that providers may be facing in the medium and long term with regards to their aid allocation. So right now, whatever the motivation, whether it's crudely love, greed, or fear, as Andrew spoke to, countries are all facing immediate pressures in terms of macro stabilization and humanitarian action. But in terms of longer term assistance, that will still be needed as the world recovers beyond the most immediate effects of COVID-19. So the positive side of this is that, we think that providers still have some time to plan through their intelligent reconstruction. So for us, this intelligent reconstruction window is really starting in 2020 after the most immediate effects and continues towards 2030 with a chance to turbocharge the SDGs before 2030. So really medium term. By resilience, we mean a strong programmatic emphasis on socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable investments, which are underpinned by good governance. So the core idea is that to build back better, you need to have these ESG aspects in mind, in part to maximize aid effectiveness, and also, of course, to ensure that any investments made today do not become, tomorrow's stranded assets, so to speak. So we wanted to come at this issue with a combined approach in the global resilience framework. Development agencies still tend to look at need and capacity separately, but in this era of global threats, we want to consider the development needs together with capacity. And this is the result of that work. This will contribute to better allocations. It also gives better understanding of timeframes involved when looking at results and funding. And it also gives you a greater sense of the trade-offs being made. So to assess absorptive capacity, which we define as the ability to use funds well for sustainable development, we used several established international indices, firstly on environmental performance, secondly on social inclusions, efforts to leave no one behind and protect the most vulnerable populations within the countries, and thirdly, broader governance indicators regarding the strength of institutions, voice and accountability, corruption, things like this. So that composite measure will be on the y-axis, as you can see. And then we contrast this with the country-specific needs gap, the SDG gap, which is on the x-axis. And this is defined as the difference between the estimated costs of achieving the SDGs at a national level and the resources that are actually available based on current growth projections. So these estimates are based on a number of multiple costing studies in different sectors, which were previously compiled by Homey and John MacArthur, and that's as I said, on the x-axis. So based on these dimensions, we came up with 3 country groupings. First, you have the high need countries, which will be on the bottom right, and that's the slightly less dense cluster of countries which have extremely high need, but also low capacity. Secondly, you have the high vulnerability countries in yellow, and on the bottom left, which have proportionally lower needs, perhaps as they have already started large-scale efforts in financing, but also continue to have lower capacity. And then thirdly, in the top 2 quadrants, you have high capacity countries which have varying levels of need. Unfortunately, you can see that the kind of ultimate win-win scenario for providers is difficult, as basically the top right quadrant is almost empty and very few countries have both high need and high capacity to absorb resources. There we go. So another way to visualize these dimensions of need and absorptive capacity is with radar charts. So here you can see 3 examples of 3 different countries within the 3 different groups, alongside the 4 directions. So need is on the top, and then on the bottom left and right, you have different aspects of capacity. So Burundi is a clear example of a high need country with a sharp spike upwards on its SDG gap. And then relatively smaller on the 3 aspects of absorptive capacity. Many of the countries in this high need grouping will have SDG gaps which are worth close to the same amount as their GDP, as their projected GDP in 2025. So for example, Burundi's is one of the higher ones. It's worth 128% of its projected GDP in 2025. So that means that even if you make quite a bold assumption or heroic assumption that future tax efforts can be worth 20 or 25%, countries like this would still have to grow 4 or 5-fold to close the gap entirely just based on their domestic revenues. So that means that they will probably require external support for at least one more generation. And this is what we call the extended humanitarianism that will be necessary. And this is a kind of a legitimate holding operation while waiting for other development fundamentals to emerge or nudging the process along with external aid where it's possible. So moving on to the high vulnerability quadrant, which is exemplified here with Angola. These countries may be vulnerable in diverse ways, but they have low capacity. Their needs are proportionally smaller, sometimes because they've already, to their credit, started financing the SDGs. But there's also a risk that they may backslide to the red quadrant because they remain vulnerable. So surprisingly, in this quadrant, you do see quite a few high ODA recipients, and we have kind of a bubble chart in the full paper to illustrate this. But the patterns would suggest that there's at least some combination of countries with low need and low capacity for where it would be neither desirable nor feasible to support major intelligent reconstructions. But that's abstracting from national interest considerations, where countries may choose to provide aid there. And then high capacity countries, as I mentioned, have varying levels of need, but also more solid evidence of resilient, of ability, of observative capacity. So they have the ability to undertake effective reconstruction at scale and at pace. So for many of these countries, access to finance may be available through other roads than ODA, and allocations will inevitably be shaped by providers' national interests, as well as, like I said, abilities to leverage other sources of finance, which I'll let Homi talk about in more detail soon. And we suggest that these countries in this grouping qualify for an elastic upper tier of aid. So lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the need for nuance and the inevitable trade-offs that we face. We can unpack, the GRF further by looking within the country groupings and also within the countries themselves. Another spider chart here illustrates two countries each from two country groupings, the high vulnerability and high capacity. And these were chosen based on, Boris Johnson's recent, perhaps not so recent anymore, but recent speech in Parliament, where he criticized the UK's higher aid allocation to Zambia over Ukraine, where he said that Ukraine is more vital for UK interests. We certainly don't want to suggest that countries should take money away from Zambia and give it to Ukraine, but we wanted to illustrate how such considerations for aid agencies and development agencies can be made on rationals other than just naked self-interest alone. So yes, you can see that Zambia's needs in the straight yellow are higher than Ukraine's, as you might expect, but Ukraine has generally higher capacity to use investments sustainably, both socially and environmentally. But this doesn't extend to the governance angle, where Zambia still performs better than Ukraine, just slightly. So for that for us was a striking illustration of how national interests may overlap with SDG related opportunities. But the bigger point is also that these conditions vary within countries as much as, if not more than across countries. And looking closely at these dimensions, you can provide some key pointers for providers as to where structural progress needs to be most accelerated. And some of that can be done by external assistance rather than providing kind of hard thresholds for country aid allocation. And a final point that I just wanted to raise as well is that perhaps there needs to be a separate graduated allocation towards global commons for all countries. So for example, countries which host multiple forced migrants or hold environmentally important resources may be eligible, for finance above and beyond what the model, the global resilience framework would qualify them for. And I know that Andrew has also done some separate work on this. So that would, be a separate upper tier of development finance. And with that, I'll pass on over to Homi.
Thank you, Bea. If you can just go to the next slide, please. So, ultimately, I think our sense was that while most of these discussions about how do we allocate aid is about concessional finance, the amount and extent of concessional finance is really declining. And increasingly, the issues that we're talking about are issues about how should we allocate loans. And that could be loans by using the providers' influence in the multilateral development banks. It could be loans from their own specific agencies. But without looking at the debt environment, it becomes very difficult to really talk about, can developing countries actually sustain the higher levels of investment that we claim are required in order to at least make significant progress towards the SDGs. So we kind of were using our resilience framework to try to say that actually there are there are two problems that need to be solved at the same time. One is the problem of debt distress. That's the traditional, typical problem. And essentially what we have done up until now is urged developing countries not to take on more debt than some, I would argue, extraordinarily conservative model that says, avoid borrowing because it could land you into debt distress. So how do you avoid debt distress? But at the same time, how do you avoid what I would call development distress? And of course, the two things interact, because actually what we find is that the countries that end up with debt distress are countries that end up in debt distress because they have been unable to develop. And the countries that end up escaping from debt distress are the countries that escape debt distress because they have been able to grow and develop. And I think increasingly the research that we have suggests that the way in which, if you start from a high level of debt, the way in which you get to a much lower level of debt to GDP, i.e. an improved creditworthiness level, is by growing faster, not by cutting the amount that you borrow. So these are kind of the two questions. And so we thought it would be really useful to try to break out countries, individual countries, into their creditworthiness, and that's on the vertical axis. And basically the what we've got as the global resilience framework, but their ability to absorb more capital in order to accelerate development. And that is on the horizontal axis, although it doesn't appear to have come up in this chart. Now, obviously, I don't expect anybody to be able to see individual countries on this. But what I want to emphasize is that more or less, we've got three categories of countries. We've got a set of countries at the top. These are countries that are investment grade. If you see, these are countries like the Mexicos, Colombias, Brazils, Malaysias of this world. They have access to private capital markets at really very reasonable terms. They're investment grade, they're credit worthy, they're in many of the international indices. They can, to a large extent, pursue their development trajectories as they wish. Then you've got a number of countries right at the bottom. These are countries that are already in default. And clearly they're not going to access any kind of capital markets at all, and so fall squarely into the basket of these are countries where development finance providers have to think very carefully about exactly what they are prepared to do. It could be that they're prepared to give them some grants. It could be they're prepared to write off some of their debt, but it's a very different category. And then you've got almost all developing countries in the middle. And in what we've called speculative areas, with very different capabilities for actually achieving development and not. And we've tried to identify them as, with these little colors. In red, you can see there are a bunch of high-risk countries. And more or less, you see that the high-risk countries tend to be towards the left-hand side of this chart. And that actually suggests that their policies that B was just talking about, their policies in terms of environment, social inclusion, governance, tend to be far worse than the countries towards the right. And that suggests that you can't just throw money and hope to solve the problem in those particular countries. It has to be accompanied by some kinds of programs to help countries use that money effectively. Whereas on the right-hand side, in that speculative category, I would argue that you have much more opportunities to actually amplify the size of financing. But in essence, what we're trying to do is both provide more money and shift countries in this resilience framework towards the right-hand side so that the money can be used effectively. Next, please. So how do we do that? Well, we do it at the country level. And I think all of us know and understand the various programs that the IMF or the World Bank or others have in terms of conditioning their activities at the country level to try to improve their situation. But I would also say that there's a great deal that can be done at the international side, and that is really a part that has been neglected, I would say, in the larger development discourse. And initially, in Andrew's early slide, he had something about policy coherence. This is what we mean by policy coherence. So the first point I want to emphasize is that the role of the multilateral banks has really started to decline. So for middle-income countries today, they're only accounting for something like 20% of the total financing. For upper middle income countries, of course, it's far, far lower. They're not really the source of the real issues that we're talking about. Interestingly to me, even in low income countries, the multilateral banks are, I think, rather a low fraction. They're only about 1/3 of the total financing coming into these countries. So I don't think that we can expect the multilateral banks to do all of the heavy lifting at the national country level. I think we also have to operate at the global level. And there, what I would say is that there are a number of things that can be done at the global level to improve creditworthiness. So on the legal side, there's all kinds of legislation. Sometimes it's called anti-vulture fund legislation that can be passed in the major capital markets. The European Union now has mandatory collective action clauses in any debts issued there. Other jurisdictions do not. We have seen that the way in which much of the illicit finance is hidden in advanced economies is because the lawyers, the auditors, the accountants basically resort to what's called the ignorance defense. They just say, well, I didn't know that this was illicit. And that's enough to permit them to actually devise all these structures for hiding money, which more or less go under the heading of the opaqueness of beneficial ownership. You set up shell companies, you're allowed to put money in there, and nobody actually knows the actual owners and the origins of this money. On the international taxation front, again, whether it's sharing of tax information, whether it's the disclosure of ownership of companies, whether it's the taxation of multinational enterprises, especially the digital enterprises, all of these discussions that are only now starting to happen, all of them will have quite a substantial impact on creditworthiness. The domestic taxation, I think, is well known. fundamentally, the way in which you build your own internal credit worthiness is by having domestic taxes that ultimately will be able to repay this debt. We've discussed state contingent instruments, and finally, as I said, far greater ambition of the multilateral banks. When you look at why are countries today facing this degree of debt difficulty, it's because they're borrowing money from private capital markets rather than borrowing money from the multilateral banks. And in some calculations that I did in a separate paper, I estimated that if all developing countries had borrowed money using the multilateral banks as the channel, in other words, borrowed private markets from private bond markets, global capital markets, but channeled through the multilateral development banks rather than accessing them directly themselves, they would be saving something like $150 billion this year in debt service alone. Debt service, not the stock of debt. So it's a flow of $150 billion to developing countries that's being lost because they're not channeling the money through multilateral banks and instead going directly to private capital markets. Next, please. So in a similar fashion, we can say, well, okay, we can do some things to help on the debt distress side. Are there also things that we can say that can be done to try to improve the development impact side of things and to try to shift countries in our global resilience framework more towards the right-hand side? And here we've essentially broken it down. There's better spatial targeting. All of the efforts right now are towards what can we do for low-income countries. Even things like the DSSI, as everybody I think knows, oriented towards the low-income countries. DSSI was able to defer $5 billion of debt service in 2020 out of the something like $350 billion of debt service that developing countries ended up paying. These are very small amounts. There's almost nothing there of what I would call the middle-income country agenda. And it's middle-income countries that are now the bulk of the population and the GDPs of developing countries, where there has to be some very serious thinking about what is it that should be done to support these countries. Then I think there's an additional layer, which is that within a country, how do you actually target? And I think that there is considerable scope for much more targeting of so-called poverty hotspots, areas within each country that are lagging. We typically think, okay, let's lend to the country and then you're done. But actually, if you really want to think about inclusive development, you have to think about where those resources are going within the country. And I think that there's a considerable amount of research right now that shows middle-income countries have hotspots of poverty, low-income countries have corridors of prosperity. And so just simply saying low-income countries are poorer than middle-income countries doesn't actually tell you whether the money is going to areas where poor people live compared to richer people. On the sectoral side, I think that there's a considerable amount, but we have to keep emphasizing that now Build Back Better means more inclusive. So it's about human capital. It means greener. So it's about sustainable infrastructure. It means making sure that so-called nature, but in essence, the conservation and the issues are properly dealt with. At the end of the day, the poorest people are living on the most marginal, fragile ecosystems. And if they don't get assistance, they encroach on those ecosystems and destroy them. And so when I sort of talk about targeting those places and those sectors, what we're emphasizing, I think, is to try to make sure that there are livelihoods available for those people so they don't need to really destroy the ecosystem. And ultimately, I think we have to think about what we want to do with multilateralism, because right now we've got this very strange dichotomy. You've got international financial institutions that could potentially expand, but don't want to. They have the firepower, they have the capital, they have the resources, they don't have the political support. And then on the other hand, you have the UN development system that really wants to expand and do more, but hasn't been given the money to do it. So neither of these is really functioning to the degree that they can. And finally, I think that, you know, an instrument, if we want to think ultimately, how are we going to get this money and use it more effectively? More and more, I think there's a sense that there are national development banks now, 450 or so national development banks throughout the world, assets under management now of several trillion dollars. They can play a far greater role in channeling the money rather than government ministries. The national development banks are technically more proficient. They can provide platforms that can be scaled up. They can construct partnerships with the private sector. They're probably a heavily underutilized asset in the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, Beata, and Homi, for your wonderful presentations. And that's many, interesting points were raised about the prospects of the development finance in the pandemic era. Now I would like to invite Professor Changhong Zhang to give her comments. Changhong,
hi, thank you, Jean. Thank you for your kind invitation. Nice to meet you all. I think I met Homi in person in 2019 in Japan, right? Yes. At the lobby, the conference lobby. Yeah, very nice to meet you again. And it's pretty late here. That's why, I attend this event, because it's really difficult for me to find other experts from China. It's midnight. I use this screen, and yeah, that's really, really interesting topic. I think the report is very creative, audacious, and relevant. It is based on pragmatism and professionalism rather than political correctness. I really like all the technical terms used in this report. As we all know right now, International Development Cooperation, we see is at the crossroad and has lost its compass even before the COVID-19 pandemic. We see traditional donors made commitments, but it seems that very few can actually fulfill their promises. And the emerging donors were trying to make new rules and norms, but it seemed very difficult to do so. At the same time, this also put the traditional donors in the dilemma: should the new norms and rules made by the new donors be tamed or learned? And also for the recipient countries, we see the paradigm competition between the traditional and emerging donors also put them on the hot spot. First, of course, is the coordination issue. Second is their negotiating capacity. Does the competition provide more bargaining power for them? And of course, there are also many questions, like, the outbreak of the pandemic has made the situation even more confusing and complicated when more traditional donors are under great domestic pressure. So based on this, I think this paper is trying to propose some solutions, or at least to fill the knowledge gap at present by creating many pragmatic and very, we see, interesting ideas. I can see, I agree with most of your ideas. Here, when I listened to you, I took some note, and I also read the proposals you would like to, to propose to policymakers. And I think we have more convergence than divergence. You use different language, but actually most of the language we use here has same connotations. Like the first one, you think aid is not enough, right? We need to mobilize more resources. Now in China, aid for trade, aid for investment has been a long-term, we say paradigm we advocate. And also we need to use SDG as a kind of overarching framework for international development cooperation. And China is a strong support for this SDG. And recently China, eliminated the extreme poverty domestically. And China promises that, China is going to support other countries for poverty reduction. And this is certainly at the core of China's international development cooperation. And of course, some others like, the global resilience framework you proposed, you use needs gap, and we usually see demands driven, and you use absorptive capacity. We usually emphasize co-contribution of development partners. So it's very interesting to see that actually the report you've written here actually, represents quite a lot of our opinions. That's why I think it's really pragmatic, and it's can enhanced through mutual learning. And I only have a few concerns about the one about the national interest you proposed here. So so this is a really controversial issue. And of course, it's a reality, right? It's a reality now. But do we need to, provide a kind of framework to just like to regulate the providers or the donors, to behave like, try to not impose too much or not emphasize too much on its national interest. If you think the discourse, at least narrative change in China, and before, even now, China is still think China is implementing development cooperation under the framework of South-South cooperation, which emphasize mutual benefit, win-win, equality. But recently we see the change, we need to give more benefits to other countries. Yeah, because we think as a growing country, China now is the second largest economy, and China is willing to shoulder more international responsibilities. And also, there are some inherent inequality between countries, right? Like you are in different development stages. If we think about trade, it's really difficult for China to have equal trade with some partner countries without providing concession to other countries, because your industry is at different development stages. So this one, when we think, when we try to promote national interest, we need to be very cautious. China now, we create another new term, we say, to promote a kind of global community with a shared future. And that means provide a kind of legitimacy for China to do more domestically to help other countries. As many countries do, China is also facing a lot of domestic pressure when we do international cooperation. So this is very normal. It's not easy to balance, but sometimes, you know, when the two countries, especially when we compare developed countries and developing countries, we need to be very cautious about the degree of you know, implementing national interest. So this is one thing, and the second is about reconstruct intelligently. You know, here you were talking about you know, provide focus attention on the transformative options with countries with sound environmental and social resilience patterns. Is this similar to structural adjustment programs? So when I read this, I raised this question: how can we differentiate this with structural adjustment programs? Do we still need to impose conditionality on these countries, or we use kind of different approach to select these countries? And the last one is, you know, the report tried to propose a new kind of development effectiveness standards, right? And using mainstream cash transfers as an aid effectiveness index benchmark. I think this is also very creative, but also I think this might cause problem. So how can we use this as a benchmark without, you know, do you think we need to give them cash first? Or, you know, I think it still cause some merriment issues. Like, I can give you an example, you know, during the pandemic, Chinese government input about 6 trillion RMB to the, not to, it was supposed to give all the people influenced by pandemic. And the way we did it is to provide the fund to the enterprises, not to the people, the employees. So this is very efficient. You know, the huge amount of money goes to each and every enterprises within 7 days. So to keep these enterprises survive in 3 months. And during the pandemic, these enterprises actually provide basic living expenses to their employees. And the government also, you know, give them exempt from paying electricity, rent, and also some other related expenses. So this is very efficient compared to cash transfer to each and every individual. So this is more, I think this is more effective. And also, you know, in development cooperation field, we usually compare welfare strategy with development strategies. And right now, we think development strategies is more effective than welfare strategies. And so I don't understand why you choose cash transfer as a kind of aid effectiveness index. And of course, the last one, yeah, to cooperate with China. And China now is very open. If you read the recently released the white paper, you know, China is strongly supporting multilateralism, and also China want to participate more in tripartite cooperation. So I think if you want to understand China, you know, you need to know more about Chinese culture. And I don't think we are competitors. And, you know, actually we have quite a lot in common. So if you understand more, for example, if you look at China's international development cooperation, it's very embedded in our culture. And I can just give you a very simple example. If my relative came to borrow money from me, so I try to measure how much should I give it to him without thinking he will return? So probably he will ask for 10,000 yuan. I can just give him 5,000 yuan. Think, okay, if you don't return, that's fine. And on the other hand, I will think he came to ask me for money just because he think I'm not an outsider. I'm an insider. So China's International Development Corporation is very similar to that kind of, that kind of ideology. If you think that is ideology or cultural notion, and the non-interference is also embedded here strongly. And of course, for you, it's very culturally different. So I think, without going deep into our cultural difference, it's really difficult to understand each other. Okay, I just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chang, for your wonderful comments. And I would like to invite Andrew, Homei, and Beata to give a quick reflection or response to Chang Hong's point. Then we will open the floor.
Shall I go just quickly? That was very valuable, and maybe 3 points. On national interest, it's intriguing. I mean, obviously, we wanted to sort of call things by their name, and since these national interests exist, and they work their way through development cooperation decisions, there's a price to be paid if all the other fine development effectiveness concerns are trumped, not to use a pun, are overlaid and are completely overruled by more opaque decisions. So at very least, what one can do is try to set some kind of scoreboard that what are you giving up in order to get some domestic advantage, and that domestic advantage is for the people of your country. It's not like an illegitimate kind of thing. It could be that you're capturing a foreign market. It could be that this country has been extremely important in your history and you wish to give them thanks. It could be a number of things. I don't see a very obvious instant sort of weighting framework or something which could instantly on a computer trade off one element and the other, as long as you're conscious of it. And that was what we referred to when we initially, people were extremely upset, as you can imagine, in the UK when Boris Johnson, in merging the development machinery of the United Kingdom with the Foreign Office, threw out little points like the fact that too much money is spent on Zambia and not enough in Ukraine, by which people, of course, understood that the realpolitik security considerations are not given enough importance. But then we said, well, if you look at where these countries can benefit and how robust or resilient they're likely to be in different dimensions, you might have different opinions about the relative merits of investing in A and B. There's some clear-cut things like the absolute need to close the SDG gap, proportional needs to close the SDG gap, whereas no question about where the humanitarian and ethical sort of imperative lies. And if you say, I don't care, I have a national interest which overrides that, then you are obviously, at least people can see what you're sacrificing by making that decision. But it's an interesting questions about, and I don't think we thought of a sort of nice, neat regulatory framework where we could rat people over the knuckles for doing too much national interest or conceivably not enough national interest. On reconstructing intelligently or build back better, we dropped that language at some point because it's become a little bit hackneyed. But the idea is actually kind of counter to conditionality. It's more going back to the sort of noble Collier dollar idea that you cannot change fundamentals through conditionality unless there is already a domestic willingness to go in that direction, and then you have to try to accompany it in some ways. But as I think also Homi was mentioning, the time scale to radically change fundamentals which are missing, and without which your investments will fail. They will not sustain themselves in environmental, in social, or in political terms. They will collapse. Much larger than the time scale of the typical adjustment program. One example, which I think is key, is that, you know, to boost dynamically the kind of skills regimen, the kinds of education systems that are suited to a digital age in some countries, will require a generation or perhaps two of sustained education expenditure and technology, which has to be, where there's no chance that the fiscal space exists already for that, or will even exist in 5 or 10 years. Are the international institutions prepared to underwrite such a change, even if it requires patience on a generational scale? That's not how the incentives work for that. So that's the second one. The third one, we do not claim to be the authors of the idea of using cash transfers as a benchmark. But there's some intriguing writing, particularly using random controlled trials, that particularly in some relatively, it must be said, soft areas like enterprise development, small scale entrepreneurship, etc. The heavy-handed bureaucracy, if you like, or intermediation of aid projects, in terms of its ultimate outcome, does not produce outcomes per dollar that are as good in some cases as directly giving the money to people who, yes, will misuse some of the money and use some of it well, or different people will use it different. But it does tend to be, if you consider the entire background, which is often ignored because it's charged to some other account, of the whole development cooperation effort, it is not necessarily a more efficient way of doing it. So the idea is, use it as a test, what if we simply gave a portion of this project directly in the form of cash transfers? What would happen? Not is necessarily the first best solution, and you're not going to change, I don't know, legal systems and complicated education systems, etc., simply by giving people money or even giving governments money. But that was it was an intriguing idea to just test. It's not a magic bullet for all solutions. I'll leave it at that.
Maybe I can just add a couple of words, and thank you so much. I mean, I think that was such a thoughtful and helpful reading of the paper. I really appreciate it. Look, on the national self-interest, let's just give a couple of examples so that we understand exactly what it is that we're talking about. Right now, sitting here in Washington, anytime people look at a Chinese loan, they say debt diplomacy. You are deliberately trying to make these countries overly indebted, and once they can't repay you, then somehow you own them. And it goes back a little bit to a sort of a traditional bankruptcy court, that when a company essentially goes bankrupt, the ownership shifts from the equity holders to the debt holders. That's nonsense. I mean, I know in reality it's nonsense, but it is the way in which the narrative is being portrayed. So to me, what's really important is to develop some principles so that when one says national interest, it's very clear about what that national interest can include and what it does not include. And I think it has to do, to some extent, with a sense of fairness. So you could not have a national interest where, for example, you try to encourage a country to abandon WTO principles of fair trade. You know, that would be an example of where that would be something that would be off. So I think that sitting down and trying to work through what are these principles that ultimately are about openness and fairness to global competition would be really useful in delineating where national interest is an acceptable part of the competitive environment and where it's not. Another example would be in essentially in all of the telecoms stuff. If it is an open source technologies, there is much less quote unquote national interest than if they're closed and proprietary technologies. So ultimately, a lot of this is going to depend on transparency. And transparency is still an area where, even though there are moves in the right direction for China, I don't think that there is, there is still too little information, and it just leaves you, to be perfectly blunt, it leaves you exposed to people making up all kinds of things which are completely untrue, but it doesn't matter. You know, and I mean, we see this not just on the development side, but on anything here today in politics. You can make up anything. So there's got to be something on the table that shows exactly what are those principles of national interest and of transparency that draws that line. So I would just encourage that kind of movement. I think, like Andrew said, intelligent reconstruction is not structural adjustment. Structural adjustment is actually a stroke of the pen policy change. And I'm not going to apologize for structural adjustment because I was involved with several of these programs. And, you know, I look at Southeast Asia, for example, where they did structural adjustment of the financial system. And their banks today are so much stronger than they were in 1997 when I was at that time at the World Bank. We came in and helped many of these countries to adjust their financial systems. I'm not going to argue that that was a bad thing, but obviously the countries seized that agenda themselves. Here, what we're talking about is much, much more technical assistance and much more focused assistance. So let's say, for the sake of argument, you put in place a solar-powered project that is connected to the grid. If the intention is, let's have much more renewables and clean energy in this country, then it has to also be accompanied by legislation and regulations on things like feed-in tariffs, allowing small-scale solar as well as large-scale solar installations and all the rest of it. That is intelligent reconstruction. It's not structural adjustment as in stroke of the pen reforms. It's really saying, let's concentrate on the issue, how do we get green energy, and then thinking about the totality and helping with technical assistance to actually deliver that on a larger scale than just the project scale. I was really intrigued by your comment also about enterprises, giving money to enterprises or people. And one could even say governments or people. I think in China, there is a willingness to think that all governments are good governments and are trying to do the best for their people. In a lot of places, that just isn't the case. And, you know, you have to know and understand where it is the case and where it's not the case. And in many places now, it turns out that actually cash transfers are the best development strategy. It is not a welfare program. That's what's so interesting. It's a development strategy. So in Northeast Kenya, where they gave cash transfers to several poor households, what they found was that all of the households who did not receive the cash transfers 1 year later were as well off as the households that did receive the cash transfers because of the spillover effects on local labor markets and local wages. So that is actually how you get money into certain poor areas of the country. I think it can be terribly effective, and actually China has used it so effectively with the rural dibao. I mean, you would not have eliminated poverty in China without the rural dibao programs. That is cash transfers. So I think it's a you know, it is something that should be thought of. And as you go through, I mean, I think China's making great strides to being more open and having more constructive dialogues. And I'm really, I'd really like to ask what you think are the best mechanisms for that. I know that you were having in the past some technical discussions with the DAC. Is that the right forum? The Global Partnership, to be honest, for Effective Development Cooperation no longer seems to me to be the right forum. Maybe it's the G20 Working Group. I don't know. I'd be really curious to hear from you where you see the best forum for having that kind of discussion is on the global level, or whether you see the best way of doing this is at the individual country level, to do it through what we used to call just, you know, donor cooperation kind of discussions. But thank you again.
Thank you, Home and Andrew. And we are running out of time, so I'm going to take a few questions from our participants. Then, Beata, you're welcome to respond to the questions. Thank you. So now the floor is open, and I see Try B, would you like to ask your question? You're unmuted, Try B. Martin, can you unmute Try B? Modern technology. So now I would like to invite other participants. Alex, any comments or questions? Because I know you're conducting very interesting research on the trilateral cooperations between UK, Brazil, and Africa. So it'd be good to hear, you know, your insights on the development cooperation front.
Thank you, Zhang, for that for that invitation to comment. I mean, I was very interested both in the presentations and the discussion. You mentioned trilateral cooperation. Of course, one of the key features, I work with Brazil rather than with China, and Brazil is a very small provider of financial support for development, particularly since the scandals affecting Brazilian National Development Bank funding for projects in Africa, but remains a significant provider of know-how. And I'm wondering how that fits into the models that the panelists were discussing for intelligent reconstruction, whether knowledge intensive as opposed to financially intensive contributions of the kind that Brazil provides in development cooperation. And China also provides as well, but China has more financial muscle in addition to its know-how. but Brazil still retains a very significant reputation for technical excellence in certain fields, and that's seen as a resource by African partner countries. How does that fit in with the models that the panelists were discussing? Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew or Beata or Homi, would you like to respond to that question?
I'll give the floor to Beata because she's been waiting to say something. So on the subject of knowledge flows as well as anything else.
Sure, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, we didn't really go into it in this presentation, but it is mentioned in the paper that, you know, within this intelligent reconstruction, we really do see all countries as potentially being, you know, both transfers and users of you know, assistance or knowledge transfers. So I think we gave the example of, you know, like Africa's experience with pandemics. So that is a part of the paper that we just didn't really go into in this discussion. Don't know if you want to add anything to that, Andrew, Homi.
I mean, certainly in very specific areas, you know, Brazil is such an expert in certain aspects of rural development, especially with tropical soils, and that's been so critical in parts of Africa. You know, when we talk about the transfer of resources, I mean, money is one thing, but obviously expertise is another. And I think that, you know, in our framework, what we were trying to do was to actually emphasize that we do need to shift countries. What essentially that would do, if you wanted to try to use our framework, is it would improve countries along that global resilience scale that we talked about. It would shift them to the right, make them more capable, and in so doing, make them improve their capacity to absorb additional financing of investments.
Sorry, I wanted to add a question to the group and certainly to Professor Zhang of my own, and it comes up in our paper. Is there a moment in time now, particularly as we're looking at the climate change agenda, to argue for a different aggregate, a different measure of global cooperation than that which has been traditionally linked to ODA? This is not to let off the hook those who've made promises about aid in the old-fashioned sense, but should there be recognition, appropriate recognition, but also measurement of aid which is in, by definition, the global interest, and therefore confers benefits indirectly to the giver as well as to you know, whoever else might be involved in it, particularly to do with climate change and pandemic. If you think of right now, the hoops that people are trying to go through to score how much assistance they give to combat the pandemic and what should count therein, and you just do some simple mathematics of, let's say, $10 per treatment dose times however many million people for however many million years, you very quickly absorb a very large part of what is traditionally being considered the ODA part. So you ought to be thinking in different scales and provide different incentives. What does China or what do people that you know talk about that? Obviously, it's also development. If you don't live, you can't develop. So, you know, we're not minimizing the importance of health assistance, but climate change and other things are going to be requiring huge sums, and they're going to be muddied with aid budgets and non-aid budgets, and people are going to sort of discuss the sex of angels, as they used to say, in order to try to split these things up. What do you think?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, probably I can answer Homi's question first. the platform you mentioned about, which platform will be effective to cooperate with China. Definitely UN system. China is strong supporter to UN. Everything can be discussed under the UN Charter, UN rules. And also now the attitude of China is open nowadays. I think, if anybody wants to cooperate with China, China is open. That's the official narrative right now. I think if we compare a few days ago, it's really difficult for China to dispatch a government official to join international forum like GPDC, as you mentioned. But now I think, all the Chinese government officials are encouraged to participate in these different forums. And G20, of course, and also we have different China-initiated different platform like RCEP or 16+1, or a lot of different platforms. The only thing I think is the mistrust between China and the other countries. China will be a bit hesitant to join DAC, as we think, probably Zhang want to manipulate China or something. That's just like, you are cautious to work with China because you have some cares, your own cares. So that's the reason behind this is mistrust between each other, I think. And the second one, Andrew's question, yes, it's the most complicated question to measure China's aid. But if we go into deeply, China's aid that is very similar to Western standards. If we just calculate about aid, we have development finance, but when we calculate, if you look at our white paper, when we calculate China's development finance, we only calculate the part falls into concession loans or interest-free loans or preferential loans. Only the part of concessionality or preferential rate were calculated into it. Of course, not everything is monetized, like, China dispatch medical group to other developing countries, and China also provides a lot of material aids to other countries. And also China, build a lot of complete projects like Agriculture Technology Center in about 25, at least 25 African countries. Yet these sometimes are really difficult to calculate. This is a kind of Chinese way to do this. If you think about China's poverty reduction, all the Western journalists try to use the standards like, $1.9, right? Or $5.5 World Bank standards to measure China's poverty elevation. Actually, within China, we use very interesting measures, like we call it we say two no worries. That means you don't need to worry about food and clothing, and 3 guarantees, like you have guarantees to have access to comprehensive education, medical service, and housing. So these are not monetized, and it's very complicated. In China's foreign aid, that's the same. I think it's really difficult to calculate. And I think now transparency issue is really, we can say, a very urgent issue for China. But if you look at the data, actually everything is recorded in different documents, but China is not providing aggregate data like, US. You have 6 kind of 4 to 5, 6 budget system, right? Or marrying system. You can check all the data related to each and every projects. China don't have this kind of aggregated budget system. But if you go through different systems, like to see the budget from different departments, you can always trace China's data related to aid and development cooperation. And I think the most reliable resource is the one provided by Ministry of Finance. Each and every year they have the record for the expenditure of China's aid.
Yes, I'm sorry, I wasn't. I mean, I've actually have done some work on Chinese aid. We published the CGD estimates, you know, and an awful lot of work, obviously, on concessionality of loans and so on. But I didn't want to go into that. I was more talking at the sort of philosophical level of whether help to save a planet, to be crude, or things which are of a global commons benefit, not necessarily of any single individual developing country benefit. Should be classified separately internationally. I wasn't thinking particularly about how China would account for it, but that was the point. Sorry.
The climate change, I forgot, you know, the long-standing position for China is respective accountability, what's RCEP, common but differentiated responsibility. That's for climate issue, common but differentiated responsibility. And now we see it's under the framework of global community to promote global community for a shared future. This also is embedded in China's domestic transformation, you know, in the China's 14th five-year plan. And we really prioritize sustainability, green development, and a huge amount of resources will go to that direction. We think, you know, first we need to do it better at home, and then we'll have more capacity to help other countries. So.
Thank you, Chang Hong, and time is up. Any final comments from Beata or Home?
Yeah.
Just to say thank you, Chang Hong, for your really great comments. I won't try to, you know, gild the lily on what Homie and Andrew have already said, but it's really good to get the Chinese perspective. And, you know, I myself have also been doing a little bit of work on analyzing the white paper, and it's quite encouraging. So it was good to also hear your perspective. But thank you.
Really nice talking to you, and it's a really interesting report. I learned a lot from this, and I think it's very inspiring. And we'll try to convey these messages to Chinese policymakers if possible. Yes, thank you, Jing, for organizing this nice conversation.
Thank you very much. Yeah, really appreciate it.
For participation at such late time. And it's a fascinating report. I hope we will have an opportunity to discuss further in the near future. And thanks to all the participants, and hopefully we'll
Thank you.
Hope to see you in person soon again.
Yeah, hope so. Hope so. Thank you. Bye.